A week has passed, but even today, the people living in the small town on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, are still talking about Donald Trump's appearance in this town. And the question from a 10-year-old girl named Emily startled Donald Trump, leading to an ending that brought everyone in the hall to tears that day. Going back to a week ago. The church hall in Charleston, South Carolina, filled with people's conversations and the sound of wooden chairs scraping against the floor. This was the place where people usually gathered to discuss town affairs or organize parties, and it was also where they came together to pray every Sunday. But today, it was truly different. Inside the hall was the presence of Donald Trump. In such a small hall, his presence was unmistakable. His orange skin and signature hand gestures were familiar to everyone, but tonight, he was calm and more pensive than usual. Perhaps he sensed the importance of this evening. The hall was filled with all kinds of people, from retired elderly individuals to young people, women, and sometimes even children who came with their parents to participate and witness the appearance of Donald Trump. But in the crowd, there was 10-year-old Emily, wearing her most beautiful dress, holding tightly onto a worn leather-bound Bible pressed against her chest. It was a treasured heirloom passed down from her late grandmother. The pages were old, and the gold lettering had faded. Her mother sat beside her, and they had discussed something before coming. Emily asked her mother, "Can I ask him?" Her mother replied, "Of course, but only if you have enough courage. And only if you are truly serious about your question." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been preparing for her question for a long time, writing it down in her diary and practicing asking it every night before bed. This was not just a spontaneous question, it was something she had cherished for a long time and had been ready to ask on this very day. The meeting gradually went on. Trump shared and spoke about his usual topics, policies, achievements, and the future of America. He discussed upcoming plans and measures to improve and ensure the well-being of everyone, especially in this small town. After Trump's speech, the people in the hall responded with applause and nods of agreement. However, everything felt different from his other speeches. There was no loud cheering or noise. And Emily waited for her chance, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with each passing minute. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived, the opportunity to ask Donald Trump questions. Retired elderly men, as well as men and women of all ages, eagerly stepped forward with their prepared questions, addressing local issues, national policies, and sometimes even offering compliments on his appearance, such as his signature red tie. Donald Trump asked, "Does anyone else have a question?" Emily hesitated, curling up against her mother in her seat. But when her mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder and gave a reassuring pat, she knew this was her moment. She bravely raised her hand. Her legs trembled as she stood up, her heart pounding so loudly that she was sure the entire room could hear it. The tension made her break out in sweat, even though the weather was not hot. The murmurs faded, and silence took over as she stepped forward. All eyes turned toward her. A little girl with an old Bible in her hands, what kind of question could she possibly ask? The thought was evident on the faces of everyone in the room. Trump looked down at her. His expression softened slightly, surprised. "Young lady, what is your question?" he asked, but his tone had changed in a remarkable way. Emily took a deep breath, clutching the Bible so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then, with a trembling voice, soft but loud enough for everyone to hear, she spoke. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" At that moment, the entire room fell completely silent in astonishment at Emily's question. Eyes darted back and forth between the little girl and Trump. The weight of her question pressed on everyone like an invisible force. For a famous politician like Trump, quick and precise answers were second nature. But today, he chose silence. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. And something in his demeanor changed. Before Trump could respond, the room felt frozen in time. Everyone held their breath, waiting anxiously for his answer, just as Emily did at that moment. For a man who built his career on swift counterattacks and unwavering confidence, this pause was unusual. Once again, he looked around the entire room, then fixed his gaze on Emily for a long moment. The sharpness he usually carried in his words was replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. The Bible in her hands seemed to capture his attention. His lips parted, but no words came out. Fear made time slow to an unbearable crawl. Her legs felt numb, and her small frame shifted slightly. Most of the people in the room followed Trump's gaze, now fully focused on her. Her question was not meant to challenge or provoke. It was pure sincerity, born from a deep longing to understand something far greater than herself. And somehow, that sincerity spoke louder than any political debate or campaign slogan. The crowd was still waiting. Occasionally, the creaking sound of old chairs or the muffled coughs of elderly men could be heard. But none of it could break the frozen atmosphere in the room at that moment. Finally, Trump raised his hand slightly, as if to steady himself, and leaned against the podium. "That is a big question," he began, his voice lower and more measured than usual. "And it's not a question I always have an answer to." His admission surprised many. Trump, known for his unwavering confidence, had just acknowledged uncertainty before the crowd. He looked back at Emily, and his expression changed again, this time into something even more personal. "When I was your age," he continued, "I also had many questions and doubts about God. Like you, I was taken to church by my parents every Sunday to pray." He recalled sitting in pews similar to the ones in this very room, listening to the pastor's sermons about God. But sometimes, his eyes would drift toward the window, wondering whether God was really listening to his prayers, or if he was just talking to himself. His life had been filled with failures and great losses, and at times, events so overwhelming that he wasn't sure he could move forward. And in those moments, his questions and doubts about God grew even stronger. He thought that God wasn't always by his side. "There were times when I was angry," he admitted, "and I thought that God had abandoned me completely." The entire room was captivated by his words. This wasn't the usual polished rhetoric, the rehearsed speech, or the commanding presence people were used to. This was something raw, something honest, a personal reflection. And this was only the beginning of an evening that no one in the room would ever forget. "But I will tell you this," Trump said, his voice slightly firm. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized that faith is not always about having answers. It is about believing that even when you cannot see the full picture, there is still a purpose, that it is God's plan. That something greater has been set in place for us by Him." He glanced at Emily. Her grip on the Bible had loosened slightly. Her wide eyes shimmered under the light of the hall. "I believe that God is the reason for life," he said slowly. "He is the reminder that even when we stumble or fail, the journey is not over. He always encourages us to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead becomes the hardest and most uncertain." But before the weight of his words could fully settle, Emily's eyes filled with tears, and the crowd began murmuring softly, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. At first, Emily's tears fell silently, a single tear rolling down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible tightly to her chest. But then, as Trump's words lingered in the air, her shoulders began to tremble. The crowd noticed. Their whispers grew louder, yet no one dared to interrupt. At that moment, her mother instinctively placed a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered gently. But Emily shook her head. This was not sadness, it was something much deeper. Trump had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear. And in doing so, he had touched a part of her young heart that she had kept hidden for so long. Trump seemed to notice her reaction and stepped away from the podium. His face remained calm and composed. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Emily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. That is a beautiful name, he said with a slight smile. You know, Emily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. And sometimes, those questions remind us of what truly matters. Emily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving him. My grandmother used to say that too, she said softly. She said that God always listens, even when you don't realize it. That He never leaves us, that He is always with us. Trump's expression flickered with something unspoken, a mix of admiration and understanding. He took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the crowd. You know, he said, his voice deep and steady, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us? That is not an easy question. Because it forces us to look inward. It makes us confront our fears, our doubts, and even our flaws. The room fell completely silent. The weight of his words settled heavily upon everyone. For a moment, it felt as though Emily was not just a little girl holding a Bible. She was the defining presence of the evening. Her courage had changed the entire tone of the night, transforming it from an ordinary town hall meeting into a profound reflection on faith and humanity. Trump continued speaking, his tone becoming solemn yet deeply reflective. We are living in a world where people constantly seek answers from things outside of themselves. Many believe that power, fame, or material wealth can fill the emptiness in their hearts. But that is not the truth. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, as if waiting for something. The real answers are not always easy to accept. Sometimes, they require us to confront ourselves, to ask, what am I living for? What do I truly believe in? And who am I when no one is watching? Trump fell silent for a moment, then turned his eyes toward Emily. Thank you for reminding me of this, Emily. You have a wisdom that many adults have yet to attain. A round of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then quickly spreading throughout the room. But Emily seemed indifferent to the praise. The tears on her face had dried. Now, in her eyes, there was a quiet pride. She gently wiped her face with her sleeve and turned to look at her mother. Her mother smiled, her eyes glowing with deep emotion. But as the applause gradually faded, Trump's tone shifted, a subtle yet distinct change, signaling that the conversation was not over. The air in the room grew heavier, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for his next words. The room sank into absolute silence. Even the faintest whispers disappeared. Every gaze was fixed on Trump as he shifted slightly behind the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the small face of Emily. His expression grew more contemplative, carrying a weight that extended beyond political responsibility, something deeper, a memory, a personal experience he was about to share. When I was young, Trump began, his voice slow and filled with reflection, I used to believe that I had everything figured out. I had ambition, I had plans, and I had an unyielding will to succeed. But then, there was a moment in my life, just one moment, that made me realize how small my control over everything truly was. He paused briefly, allowing his words to settle into the silence. The entire room seemed to lean forward, curiosity evident in every pair of eyes. Trump rarely revealed personal aspects of his life, and now, it seemed he was about to do so. My brother, Michael. Trump continued, his voice measured, each word carrying a heavy emotion. He was one of the kindest and most genuine people I have ever known. There was a special light inside him, a goodness that, at the time, I couldn't fully understand. But Michael had his own struggles. He fought battles within himself, and no matter how much my family tried to help, it was never enough. Trump paused for a moment. As if searching for steadiness in his words. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his usual composure. When he passed away, I was angry. Angry at him. Angry at myself. And angry at God. Some people in the crowd bowed their heads, lost in their own thoughts. An elderly woman gently placed a hand over her chest, as if Trump's words had touched a pain she had once experienced. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone so full of potential, had to leave this world so soon. Emily's eyes never left him. Her young face carried a depth of understanding far beyond her years. Around her, others were just as captivated, drawn into Trump's story, their expressions a mixture of empathy and curiosity. For a long time after that, Trump continued, I turned my back on God. I asked myself, if he truly exists, why would he let this happen? Why take Michael and leave me behind? He sighed, his hands unconsciously gripping the edge of the podium, as if searching for something to hold onto amidst the surge of emotions. But then, something changed. Trump paused, letting his words sink deep into the minds of his listeners. The room was utterly silent, no one blinked, no sound was made. I'm not sure if it was a dream or just a vague memory, but one night, I saw Michael's face in my mind. He was smiling, that same goofy smile I always remembered. And I heard him say, don't be angry. You still have so much to do. The silence in the hall was no longer one of anticipation, but of profound respect. And that was the moment I realized, Trump said, his voice growing steadier, that faith is not about understanding everything, it's about believing that there is meaning behind it all, even when we cannot see it. Trump turned back to Emily. She was still standing there, her wide eyes filled with contemplation. So, when you ask me what God means to me, Trump said, his voice gentle yet powerful, I would say that he is the reason I keep going, even in the hardest moments. He is the reminder that we do not exist just for ourselves. And above all, he is the source of hope, even in the darkest times of our lives. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd, as if everyone was letting his words sink into their own thoughts. Emily lowered her head slightly, her face thoughtful, as though what he had just said had touched something deep within her soul. But this time, no tears fell down her cheeks. She stood straighter, her small hands gripping her grandmother's worn Bible tightly, as if it were the most precious thing she owned. At that moment, a man near the back of the hall slowly stood up, raising his hand to signal that he wanted to speak. He looked ordinary, his face weathered by years of hard labor. Perhaps he was a mechanic, a father, or just someone who occasionally went to church when he had the chance. But when he spoke, his words rang out clearly and firmly. Mr. Trump, he said, I have spent years searching for my own faith. Hearing you talk about anger, doubt, and hope makes me wonder, are we all just too afraid to admit that we are struggling within ourselves? Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to make Trump pause for a brief moment, but he did not let the hesitation last long. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes meeting the man's, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the sincerity behind the question. You know, he began, his voice steady, I believe that many of us are afraid to admit that we are not as strong as we want others to think we are. The entire hall remained silent, everyone listening intently. Faith has never been easy, Trump continued, his voice calm and steady. It is not a straight or simple path. Sometimes, it feels like calling out into the void with no response. But that is precisely what makes faith strong. It does not require perfection, it requires perseverance, the willingness to keep moving forward even when we don't have all the answers. The man slowly nodded, his expression softening at Trump's words. He quietly sat back down, and a gentle wave of murmurs spread through the hall in quiet agreement. Suddenly, Emily spoke up, her voice breaking through the stillness. My grandmother always said that faith is like a seed that is planted, she said, her tone clear and firm despite her small frame. You don't always see it grow right away, but you have to believe that it will. Trump smiled, a rare smile, one that was genuine and gentle, different from the usual stern expression he often carried. Your grandmother must have been a very wise woman, he replied. And she was absolutely right. Faith is a seed. Sometimes, it doesn't grow in the way we expect, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. It is still growing, quietly and steadily, in ways we cannot yet see. The atmosphere in the room seemed to lighten, as if everyone collectively exhaled after a moment of tension. Those who had come expecting a political speech now found themselves part of something much greater, a conversation about faith, loss, and the things that truly matter in life. Trump scanned the room, his eyes meeting the faces of those who were listening intently. "There is something I have learned over the years," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Faith is not always found in grand moments. More often, it is in the small things, in the way someone reaches out to help, in the way someone listens to your pain, or in a brave question like the one Emily just asked." He paused for a moment, his gaze returning once more to the little girl. "Thank you, Emily, for reminding me of this." Applause began, at first, just a few scattered claps, but soon it spread throughout the entire hall. Some people stood up, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, a moment where an 8-year-old girl had the courage to ask a question that many adults had long avoided. Emily turned to her mother, her voice soft but certain. "Grandma would be proud of me, wouldn't she, Mom?" Her mother smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears of emotion. "More than proud, my love. She would be deeply moved." And sometimes, it is the bravest questions that bring the most unexpected answers.